Hi guys, this is chapter 9, issue 3 and 4, and you should be watching this if you have already, well, you can either do it at the beginning or the end, I guess, but you should be on key issue 4. You don't have to do this for key issue 3 since key issue 3 is quite long. Okay, but I am going to talk a little bit about key issue 3 stuff at the beginning, so this one is on energy, and then we're talking about development a little bit more with key issue 4. Okay, so when a country is developing, industrializing, gaining infrastructure, getting a stronger economy, becoming more involved in world trade, there are some things that can happen that can make development not sustainable. So one thing is the depletion of natural resources. So after the Industrial Revolution happened, that Europe became really strapped for resources, natural resources, especially things like water access, iron ore, things like that. So they went to Africa and places in Southeast Asia and even Latin America to get more of these resources. And that's still a problem. We still are depleting natural resources faster than we can get them back, okay? It's very much like overfishing when we talked about that last chapter, okay? Part of the problem is also mass consumption. We have, especially in developed countries, a high demand for products, and there isn't always necessarily enough resources to make those products. All of this comes with more pollution, right? And then we have to fight pollution, which is also very costly. Pollution is now leading to climate change, which is exacerbating a lot of these environmental issues. And now we are also trying to find ways to repair the damage that we've done with our CO2 emissions, right? And then also issues of health and social and economic equality. Developing nations, when you're a developed nation, it doesn't mean that every gender and every person has the same opportunities, right? So inequality, even as a country develops, persists, and it's something that we have to combat, okay? Okay, so a little bit on energy. Basically what that chapter is really trying, that section of the chapter is really trying to get at is that demand for energy is higher than the resources we have for energy. Energy demand is higher in developed countries. That probably makes sense. Who drives cars, right? All of these things, who powers homes in developing countries, that's not as common. So, of course, they are going to have a lower demand for energy. The United States is the largest consumer of energy. We are also the most reliant country on fossil fuels and produce the most emissions, so not so good. However, it's a little bit uneven because we have the highest demand for energy in these core countries, right, these developed countries, but most of the energy, actually, the reserves for energy are actually in the LDC or semi-periphery, like middle developing world. Okay, for example, the largest oil reserves are in Saudi Arabia, but who consumes a lot of oil? The United States. Does that make sense? It's kind of uneven. Okay, so what do we do about this? The bottom line is we don't have the resources to keep up with the amount of energy consumption that we are currently using. Okay, so basically, eventually, we are going to run out of energy resources. Okay, so we have to find alternative sources of energy, which is why there's been so much focus on solar power, wind power, geothermal power over the past decade. A problem with those energy types is that they are typically more costly than fossil fuels, or other traditional coal, other traditional energy resources, okay? So as a society, we will have to weigh the pros and the cons, right? We'll have to figure out, like, okay, well, it's going to cost more, but it's more sustainable in the long run, so we'll have to figure that out. Okay, Now I'm switching over to key issue 4 stuff. So there's two ways that countries can become developed, but either way, there would need to be a little bit more connectivity to other countries in the world. Having said that, there is the self-sufficiency path. Your book gives you India as an example. There's not a lot of examples of countries that do this because it tends to be less successful, and even India now has started to switch over to the international trade route. Okay, but self-sufficiency means that a country trades within itself, tries to develop isolated from other countries, doesn't get those trade relationships with other countries. This is good because it's easier to spread investment around the country a little bit more evenly. So you don't get those, it's less likely that you get those urbanized areas that are very, very industrious and successful, and the rural areas that don't get that, right? This takes a lot longer than the international trade route. Usually it leads to less growth. And there's no incentive because there's no economic competition. So there's no incentive to improve your product, okay? Because if I'm the only person that's going to sell sailboats, I don't know why that was the first thing that came to mind, but let's just go with sailboats. If I'm the only person in town that sells sailboats, I can make them however I want because it's the only one you can buy, right? Whereas if you had international trade, you'd also have sailboats from France and from Italy, and they would probably be better made than my janky ass, the sailboats. My dogs, sorry. International trade. So most countries do this, right? Including the United States. So countries are open to foreign investment in international markets. It's just like when we looked at where our products come from that we eat, the same thing happens with all products, right? There's a reason we get so many things from China. It's because we have trade deals with them, okay? Countries typically specialize in a product for trade. So China, I'll go back to them for an example. They are manufacturing mecca, even though Bangladesh and places in India are also starting to do that. But basically, your iPhones, I don't know, Samsung, I guess, is in Korea, but lots of electronic devices are made in China and just other places in Asia because they specialize in that, okay? It encourages economic relationships with other countries. Typically, it's sort of like the European Union's idea, right? Like if we all have an economic relationship, we have guaranteed peace, right? I wouldn't say guaranteed, but it's more likely when you have these international trade relationships. Problems with the international trade method is that resources are not typically distributed evenly, so you can get lots of inequality both in wealth and in like job opportunities. And it can lead to worldwide economic crises. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in class, but basically I'm talking about the 2008 recession, the housing bubble that took place in the United States. Because we had a trade relationship with all of these other countries throughout the world, when our economy declined, everybody else's economy declined as well. So that's a definite risk factor when you look at international trade. Okie dokie. So when a country is deciding whether or not they want to develop a trading relationship with another country, they look at a couple of different things. The first is the comparative advantage. These are both, by the way, not in your book, so it's really important that you write these down. This is developed by David Ricardo, and basically a country produces items that it has the greatest resources or advantage for in comparison to other countries, okay? So if you have an abundance of a certain product in your country, that's the product you are going to use to trade, okay? So you're going to want to come up with a trade relationship where somebody needs that product that you specialize in. Does that make sense? Complementary advantage is when two regions specifically satisfy each other's needs through exchange of raw materials or finished goods. So if country A needs what country B has a lot of, and country B needs what country A has a lot of, that's like really the perfect trade relationship. That's a complementary advantage, okay? The developing world needs coffee. The developed world needs to get something in return. And we're going to talk about in a minute how that doesn't always happen. Okay, so essentially what I'm talking about, and I have referenced it a few times so far, we have the core periphery model. Children, dogs, could you stop? Oh, Teddy hit his head. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We'll do a map journal on this as well. But the core countries are going to be Europe, the United States, Canada. The semi-peripheries are going to be mostly in Latin America, a little bit in East Asia. And then the periphery countries are lots of Asian countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? So, the periphery, the periphery is dependent on the core for funding. Okay? So the core is those developing countries. They get all of their products from these periphery countries. Okay? So the periphery needs the core because otherwise they wouldn't have anybody to buy the products that they're making. Okay? The semi-periphery countries are both exploitive and dependent, meaning that they kind of do both. They rely on both the core and the semi-periphery. Okay? They get their goods from the periphery countries, the semi-periphery does, but they also still don't really, they're not developed enough to stand on their own without the core, if that makes sense. So, this is not a good thing that we're pointing out with Wallerstein's world systems theory, because it also goes with dependency theory, which means that we've had these economic events in history starting at the Industrial Revolution that encourage developing countries to depend on developed nations, okay? So the periphery can't survive without the core, okay? Because otherwise there's no market for them. There's nobody to buy their product. But the core is not reliant on the periphery. I mean, yes, it's nice to get cheap goods from the periphery, but if the periphery all of a sudden decided that they didn't want to trade with the core would say, fine, we'll just make our own stuff because we have the ability to do that. The periphery can't just find other people to buy their product. They're all in the core. Does that make sense? So basically what dependency theory says is that these economic events like imperialism, colonialism that happened largely because of the Industrial Revolution, that now we have these periphery countries that are completely dependent on core countries, okay? So it means that the core countries take advantage of periphery countries, okay? If this is way over your head and confusing, it is okay. Like I said, we're going to do a map journal. We're all going to be good on Wallerstein. But I do want you to kind of be at least familiar with this when I go over it with you, so it's not like, yeah. Okay, very good. Here's just like a map version. So the red periphery countries, although I think, you know what, I don't really like this map as much because I wouldn't consider Russia and a lot of Eastern Europe a periphery country, just saying. Semi-periphery countries, these are probably pretty accurate. And then the core countries are definitely pretty accurate. Okay? Okay. The other thing we are going to practice more in class is Rostow's model, which is the stages of economic development. Okay? So basically, what Rostow says is that all countries that go through development are going to go through these 5 stages in this order, okay? So they're going to start out as themselves, okay? So a subsistence agriculture society. There's not like a lot of buying and selling. If anything, it's a barter system, okay? So sub-Saharan African countries, we're kind of talking about them. They would be in stage 1. Stage 2 is when those countries start to get a little bit of surplus. So maybe their banana crop goes really well that year. They have a little bit extra. This means they can start thinking about trading that product and making a profit off of it. So they find their specialization, right? Their comparative advantage. And then they also start to build a little bit of infrastructure. That's the transitional stage. Stage 3, takeoff, is increased industrialization, growing investment, meaning that other countries are interested now in your products and they are willing to make some deals with you. Regional growth and political change, okay? And usually when we say political change, we're moving towards more of a democratic type of society, okay? From like some sort of like autocracy, dictatorship sort of situation. Okay, then stage 4 is the drive to maturity. This is when a country starts to diversify their economy. So maybe it's not just bananas anymore. Maybe it's bananas and coffee, bananas, coffee, and maybe minerals or something like that. So they don't have just one product that they kind of rely on. They start to diversify. They start to invent things and come up with better ways of doing things on their own rather than always learning from other countries. They become less reliant on imports, meaning they don't need things from the other countries so much because they're making a lot of their own stuff. And then also investment, right? Creating a trade relationship that also benefits your own country financially, which doesn't really happen until stage 4. So this is kind of the unfortunate thing, is until you get to stage 4, there's a lot of taking advantage of the developing country. And then stage 5 would be our MDCs, high mass consumption, meaning people are buying and buying and buying and buying, which is a good sign because they have the wealth to do so, okay? So very consumer oriented, okay? Durable goods, and then the service sector, the tertiary sector becomes dominant. In stage 1, it's going to be the primary. I would say sort of still the primary. Stage 2, 3, and 4 would be secondary. And then you get to tertiary in stage 5, high mass consumption. Yes, you have to memorize this. We're going to do a card sort in class to kind of help you. But basically, you got to commit this to memory. You'll often get test questions that say like, okay, like, I don't know, what characterizes Rostos stage 4? Or they'll give you like a scenario, this country, this is what's happening in this country, and you have to say what stage it's in. Okay. This was your CGA 10. It talked about Millennium Development Goals. I think he gives a pretty nice intro at the beginning of that blog, but basically they were developed by the United Nations, and they were used to measure how well countries were developing. So it was 4 LDCs. They said, these are the things that need to happen in order for us to not really consider you a developed country, but these are the things we want you to work towards. And it wasn't just, hey, country, you need to get your stuff together and start doing these things. It was with the UN helping those countries, right? It was saying to all member states of the UN, we need to make sure this is happening in LDCs. Okay, the deadline was 2015, so it's already happened, but here's some of them. Eradicate extreme poverty, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality, empower women. You'll notice a lot of these have to do with HDI and those things that we talked about in Chapter 9. Reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. So 2015 was the goal. The guy who wrote the article that you read talked about how these were really lofty goals, and it wasn't the expectation that all of these countries would reach this goal, all 8 of these goals. The idea was just to get them to progress towards those things. So they were important in that way, even if it's not like there's universal primary education in these places. That's absolutely not true, but they're still working towards that goal. So that's why the Millennium Development Goals were important. And now the UN has set forth these Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. In class, we're going to kind of compare the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of it's very similar. They have this cute little graphic here. You'll notice like a lot of this stuff is similar. I would say this one focuses a little bit more on the environment. I think that's a big difference I've kind of come across. But so 2030, so we'll see again in a few years how we did. Okay, and just with development also comes gender issues. We've talked about this a little bit in the previous, earlier in the chapter, but there are more women in the workforce now globally than there has ever been before. But the problem is that women are still pretty consistently getting lower wages and less employment opportunities, meaning women are only offered certain jobs. They're not offered those like CEO positions and things like that as much as factory positions, positions that are not going to get them as financially stable as they could be otherwise. Okay, so one more thing. A solution for women in developing nations, I should say, is that countries can grant women in developing nations microloans, which are very small loans. It could be like $200, $500, which is a lot of money in those countries, but not a lot of money to developed countries, so that they can start a small business, maybe buy enough of a product so they can make something to trade and sell. So this has been a solution, but it's kind of had mixed results. So there are women who have really been saved by these microloans, and there are women who have not. I found this thing on the Wall Street Journal that kind of explains the differences. So just watch, it's very short, and then we're going to call it a day. Maybe. Perhaps. Oh, sorry. Add. Oh, there's no sound. Fantastic. Well, maybe I'll show this in class then. I apologize. I don't know why it doesn't have sound. It's probably my own computer on my end. I'm using my husband's computer instead of my own. But I will talk about that in class. So we'll work that out then. But microloans are something important for you to know. Okay. So that's it for key issues 3 and 4. So chapter 11 is next. For chapter 11, key issue 1, I have a mapping activity that you're doing for homework instead of your notes. What else? I think that's about it. Yeah, all right. See you in class. Pop quiz. Probably a pop quiz.